Hello. Today we're going to be talking about suffering in the Gospel of Mark. You should have your incomplete outline with you. It should also be called Suffering in the Gospel of Mark, Incomplete Notes, and can be found on Canvas under the Mark module. Make sure you have that incomplete notes with you as you follow along and fill it in. And make sure you bring that with you to our next class. We're going to be focusing mostly on the end of the Gospel of Mark, or I should say the second half of the Gospel of Mark, but let's start with a little review. One of our main themes in the Gospel of Mark is the necessity of suffering. And this theme is anytime someone suffers for the sake of the gospel. It's not any suffering, it's specifically suffering for the sake of the gospel. We see that Jesus chooses to suffer to free us from sin and grant us eternal life. And we see this in both his words and actions. And we see a connection to the discipleship theme in the fact that Jesus' disciples will suffer too. And that in fact, suffering is part of what it means to be a disciple. The reason for this is because following Jesus is countercultural. It goes against the norms of the time and place where Jesus is, as well as many things today. After all, look at the results of what happened to Jesus for what he was teaching and doing. Look at the results of what happened to many of the disciples for what they were doing, teaching, and actually living out in their lives. And so it makes sense that we, as Christians, following Jesus and the disciples, at some point in our lives, will have to suffer for the sake of the gospel. But what's helpful here is this suffering has meaning. It's not just suffering for the sake of suffering. It's not suffering like we saw in the Old Testament before 2nd Isaiah, where it was thought to be all just punishment. This is after 2nd Isaiah suffering. This is post-suffering servant suffering, because out of this suffering comes redemption. And that is because of Jesus. So consider for just a moment here. And you'll notice with these two questions, there's a little bit of space on your incomplete notes. So I'd like you to just jot down some off the top of your head thoughts here. No need to go into great detail here as we'll come back to these questions in class, but just take a moment here. You can even pause the video if you like, to consider what are some examples of Jesus's physical and emotional suffering in the Gospel of Mark. And the fact that the examples of this theme tend to increase as you go farther through the Gospel. Remember, we didn't have any examples in the first 4 chapters. So why do you think that might be? Why would the amount of examples of the necessity of suffering increase as we go farther through the Gospel? So take a moment and just briefly answer these 2 questions on your incomplete notes. Again, just kind of off the top of your head what your first impressions are. We'll come back to those 2 questions the next time we're together in class. We can see that suffering is often the result of conflict, which connects us to another one of our themes. So as the Gospel of Mark continues, the conflict escalates. As we've already determined, conflict centers in the Gospel of Mark on interpretation of the law, and most of the conflicts are between Jesus and the Pharisees. So as the conflict escalates, the consequences are that Jesus is moved closer and closer to his ultimate suffering. So let's see how this is demonstrated in Mark chapters 11 through 13. So I suggest you grab your Bible at this point, open up to chapter 11, so you can kind of follow along with me as I give you these examples. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. If there are any of these that you think, oh, I don't remember this one very well, I'd just make a little mark on your chart, and then you can go back and look a little bit more closely at the example after you're done with the video. So our first example has to do with the temple. And we see that the chief priests and scribes hear of Jesus' temper tantrum over the misuse of what is now the second temple. Now, really, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek for me to call it a temper tantrum because Jesus is very justified in his anger here. Jesus is upset because the way they're using the temple is more of a marketplace than a place of God. And so he shows his righteous anger, and the result is the chief priests and scribes are looking for a way to kill Jesus. In fact, that seems to be the result usually, either a desire to arrest Jesus or kill Jesus, both of which are pretty big ways to respond to any of these events with Jesus. And the only reason they don't do it is because they're afraid of him. Because of the crowd, there are too many people there, too many people who might be on Jesus' side. Very ironic because we're going to see the crowd that supports Jesus for so long will turn on him very quickly in the end. So our first conflict has to do with the temple and how the temple's used, something we know is very important to the Jews from the Old Testament. Our next example of conflict has to do with authority. And if we think back to Ignatius, we know having a piece of paper that says you know what you're talking about or knowing where you get your information is very important. And so here we see the chief priests, scribes, and elders ask Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? They're trying to see what qualifies Jesus to do the stuff he does and say the things he says. And Jesus answers with a question, as he often does, and he asks them about John's baptism. And the question that Jesus asks doesn't have an easy answer. And in fact, they realize that no matter what way they answer it is not going to work out well for them. So they choose not to answer it. And Jesus then says, if you won't respond to my question, I won't respond to yours either. Which is actually Jesus being pretty smart in the way that he's responding to that situation. Our next example is the parable of the vineyard, or sometimes it's called the parable of the tenants. And in this parable, you want to look at the footnote because really this parable is all about the deeper meaning. So take a minute to think, what kind of genre might this be in addition to parable if we know that everyone and everything in the story has a deeper meaning outside of the story? And the answer to that would be allegory. So we have a parable and an allegory here. And so if we look at the meaning of this story, and if we break it down, we see that Jesus is really talking about the religious leaders and addressing them with this story. And so if the vineyard is Israel, then Jesus is saying that this vineyard, which is owned by God, was given to these tenant farmers. And a tenant farmer is someone who would work the land. They wouldn't own it, but they would work it for the owner. And so if the religious leaders of Israel are the tenant farmers, it means they're taking care of Israel for God. But then it says that the owner sends servants to check on the vineyard, and the tenants kill these servants. Well, these servants happen to be prophets. And isn't it interesting to hear that we have former religious leaders of Israel who are not listening to, not responding to the former prophets, and even at times killing them. And so the owner sends his beloved son, in this case Jesus. But rather than listening to him like the owner hoped, the religious leaders think, oh, this is the heir. If we kill him, we can keep the vineyard. But rather than that happening, otherwise the owner says, we are going to give the vineyard to someone else. And that happens to be the people of Israel. And so basically Jesus is saying, hey, religious leaders, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You killed the prophets and didn't listen to them. You're not listening to me now, and I know you're going to kill me, P.S. And if you don't change your ways, then God's going to give the responsibility for Israel to the people rather than you. And then after this parable, the religious leaders' response, rather than listening to this, they know that it's about them, which is important to note. But rather than trying to change their ways, they simply want to kill Jesus, but again, can't because of the crowd. Now we have a series of these conflicts here, and I'm going to move through them rather quickly because, again, notice that they are all about interpretation of the law for the most part. We have one about politics. This is trying to pull in the Romans by asking, should we pay taxes to the emperor or not? Jesus, comes up with a pretty sweet answer that basically avoids the trap. So they go back to talking about interpretation of the law. And so there's a question about Levitical marriage next. Remember that from Ruth. And really this question is pointing at the concept of resurrection. Remember, the Pharisees are the only group that believe in resurrection alongside Jesus. And so they ask, what if there are these 7 brothers, they all marry the same wife, and then all of these men die without an heir, and then the wife dies. Whose wife will she be at the resurrection? And Jesus' answer is, look, the fact that you're even asking this question shows you really don't understand the resurrection at all, because it's going to be nothing like what we understand. So he basically doesn't answer the question because he says the question shows they don't even understand resurrection. Then we get a little aside about the greatest commandment, which could be a possible trap, but instead Jesus answers brilliantly, and then the scribe actually praises Jesus' answer, a great reminder that everything doesn't have to be us versus them. The next one is about the identity of the Messiah. We see that there are certain expectations that the religious leaders have about the Messiah being like David, and Jesus explains that, no, actually the Messiah is going to be quite different than what they expect. And then finally, our biggest conflict in these sections has to do with Jesus warning people about the scribes who are going to be condemned for their selfish actions of, here we go, empty worship rather than social justice. We should definitely remember that from the prophets and know what a big deal that is. Okay. New term, new idea, is this idea of eschatology. And eschatology simply means dealing with the end of the world or last things. And Mark chapter 13 is the genre of apocalyptic writing. It explains that the end of the world is near and describes the great suffering that will occur before the end of the world and Jesus' return. Christians are to endure this suffering with the hope that it will be over soon and that we will then be rewarded for our faith. There's actually a reference here to a desolating abomination or sacrilege, which gets connected to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, which would be a date to know. Mark's eschatology, then, is that the end of the world will come soon because the Second Temple was just destroyed. And while this may not pan out, we shouldn't worry too much, because we see 2 other verses in that same chapter make things more complicated by saying the world will end during the current generation, and then saying even Jesus doesn't know when the world will end.